Hello, everybody, and welcome back to OMB Reviews. I am the critic who is a cynic. Hoping you're well, and today we're doing a box office breakdown for this past weekend, which saw Friday Nights at Freddy's once again take the #1 spot, even though it had a pretty massive week 1 to week 2 drop, which is not all that surprising, seeing that this is the kind of movie that was able to get all of the huge fans of the franchise to come out, but really has not been able to drive that much else out to go and see it. That all being said, the movie has crossed $200 million worldwide, now putting it in the same category as some much bigger films with much larger budgets. And I think it goes to show you that, hey, you know what? If you're going to make a movie based off of a previous IP, based off of an IP from a different genre, from a different medium, as long as you're able to reach out to the fans, as long as you're able to actually give fans something that they might actually want to see, hey, turns out if you do that and also have a constrained budget, you might actually make up a ton of money and make lots of your return on your investments with those. So we'll talk about what Tony has to say here about Freddy. He is not nearly as, I think, as kind to Freddy as you probably should be doing. But we will also be talking about some of the updated numbers for Killers of the Flower Moon, which continues to be a massive box office flop. And I know that some people mainly don't really care about that because even Scorsese himself really cares more about the art than he does about the actual box office receipts. But hey, at the end of the day, when you make a movie and you spend $200 million on that movie, and that's just in the budget, guess what? You're going to want to see that money come back. And at this point in time, it's not looking like they're going to have any of that money actually returning to them. Before going any further, please make sure you smash that like button, loud the follow button, and smash the rumble button as well. And also make sure that you are subscribed to the channel with that bell notification on. That way you know every time a video or live stream goes live on the channel. So thank you all very much for putting up with the lack of content more recently. I literally lost my voice this past week. You can kind of hear it still not quite 100%, but it is finally coming back. I've been having so much tea with honey. I think that has been a huge benefit. But again, thank you all very much for putting up with that. And I was not able to do the box office preview because of that. And so hopefully I'll be back on my regular schedule with a Tuesday night live stream at 7:30. That is a new streaming schedule. If you want to keep up with the streaming schedule and other stuff like that, go check out my website, ombreviews.com. Anyway, enough of that. Let's go ahead and talk about what Tony has to say about Freddy. Five Nights at Freddy's. I probably have said the name wrong several times over, and I'll probably have at least one person in the comment section trying to say, you keep saying it's this, but it's actually this. Okay. All right, I get it. I really don't honestly care all that much because even though I think the movie is decent, I shared my review of the film during the box office breakdown last weekend, if anyone's been looking for that, because again, of limitations with my voice and just being sick. But Tony is back at it once again. He was somebody, right, going into the weekend, he kept talking about, the day and date release, right? As for those that don't know, Five Nights at Freddy's got the same date released in theaters. It also got released on Peacock. Add to that the fact that it actually got released at 8 p.m., on the Thursday of its premiere. So you actually had every single thing going against this movie's opening weekend, and yet it ended up doing very, very well to the point where it did better than many other much larger budgeted films from massive studios with massive IPs and massive outreach, massive, theoretical fan bases that I guess we could say have definitely gone by the wayside. But even through all of that, you still had a lot of people talking about, well, how much money could it have made had it not done this model? Here's the thing. Not only did this show that the whole excuse of, it was day and date, and I'm thinking back to Black Widow and many of the other MCU titles that got day and date releases on Disney Plus, and there was a lot of people saying, well, the reason why the movie didn't make its money was because of this. Well, here's the thing. A movie like Five Nights at Freddy's shows you that you can actually have a very impressive opening, right? Even take the the day and date out of the equation. Five Nights at Freddy's had a much better opening than anyone could have possibly have expected, right? Maybe hardcore fans would have expected it, but we have to look at that as for what it is, right? That the film on its own did well. Add to that the fact that you could have seen it, you could have stayed at home. You got a free trial of Peacock. There's a free tier of Peacock as well that's ad-supported. You could have just stayed home and watched it that way instead. And yet a lot of fans, especially hardcore fans, went out to go see it in theaters. I think that shows you, guess what? You can make that work. Because also think about just how much traffic was driven to the Peacock service, right? A lot of people did watch it. I myself, one of them, someone who has young kids at home and doesn't have the time to really go out for hour and a half, 2 hour stretches in the evening time with kids sleeping and all those other things. And so I think that ultimately this is a huge success for them, despite what anything that Tony has to say. But Tony, again, loves his puns and his headlines. Says, autumn box office blues. Freddy's at 19 plus million leads Dune less frame. As strike continues. Yes, indeed. The infamous writers, in this case, the actors strike is continuing on. And hey, the only people getting hurt by that really in a lot of ways aren't necessarily even the theaters. So I think that one could argue, hey, theaters would much rather have a Dune Part 2 to come out right now. But let's also be frank about that, right? The first Dune film was not a huge moneymaker. It was not a film that drove a crazy amount of people to the theaters. I myself am very much looking forward to Dune Part 2 because I really like that first one. But again, we have to also kind of be honest about the numbers and say that, okay, it would have been nice to have that film. Definitely would have had an increase probably in overall audiences compared to last weekend. But in general, you look at these numbers and you think to yourself, yeah, the box office is still in a very, very bad state because a lot of people just do not have a lot of films that they are wanting to actually go see in theaters. And because these films are costing so much darn money, it doesn't make much of a difference anyway. But it goes on to say the ramifications of the actor strike at the weekend box office continues to be felt as ticket sales this weekend plummeted to an estimated 64.6 million, 49% from last weekend, which is currently the lowest, the fourth lowest of 2023 to date. Remember the legendary Warner Brothers and Zendaya, Timothée Chalamet, Austin Butler, Florence Pugh sequel? Wow, that is quite a mouthful there, Tony. Dune Part 2 was originally set to play this weekend, which just makes me sad because I would have really loved to have seen that. With his departure, there's at least 50 million, if not substantially more, missing from the box office. Now, I do think that Tony actually has something to say, is onto something there, because I do think that domestically, 50 million would probably be about right? Somewhere between 50 and 100 million, maybe even more accurately 50 to 80 million would be more of a realistic take. And I would say this probably could extend out even to next year when the film eventually does come out. I don't think the film really has the ability to do much higher than that. Again, just based off of kind of what we've been seeing with these movies that don't necessarily have hardcore fan bases, right? There's a lot of people that are definitely fans of the first Dune film, and someone like me, I'm a huge fan of Denis Villeneuve, but the fact still remains is that this is just not going to be the amount of money that it's going to need, not just domestically, but worldwide, to be able to bring in massive profit, bring in some massive profits. So again, I do think that this weekend would have been helped by it, but I really can't say it would be all that much. He goes on to say, speaking of day and date, the good news with Universal Peacock's Five Nights at Freddy's is that it cracked past $100 million domestic, becoming one of the few titles with such a dynamic distribution model to do so, alongside Black Widow, Dune, Godzilla vs. Kong, and Jungle Cruise. Now, here is the huge difference, though. When it comes to those movies, Black Widow was a flop because it was not able to make enough money to justify its budget. The first Dune film also really didn't quite make it as far as actual profitability is concerned. I don't remember the exact numbers for Godzilla vs. Kong, but if it did make its money back, it was not all that much profit. Jungle Cruise was also a massive, massive flop as well. And so it's interesting that they're kind of putting it in the same category, because the huge difference between Five Nights at Freddy's and all of those films is that Five Nights at Freddy's was profitable after its opening weekend, and actually ended up being a net positive in both arenas, right? Both of driving people out to the theater to go and see it and to give money that way, and also people being driven to the actual streaming service as well. It goes on, the bad news is that the movie's availability in the home to Peacock paid subs, plus the massive YA-leaning nature of the IP, saw the video game movie drop like a rock at 76%. But again, even when you have massive drops like that, this is something that I always try and say, right? You can have some of the best drops in the world or some of the worst drops in the world. What matters is how much are you dropping from, right? If you have one of the biggest opening weekends of all time, but then you have one of the biggest drop-offs of all time, if you made enough that opening weekend to cover your cost, it doesn't really matter at the end of the day. And that's the case with Five Nights at Freddy's. It made its money back already after its opening weekend. So now anything added on, even if it's significantly less than what it was in its opening, is still adding profits, right? You're still adding on just pretty much nonstop profits, and again, still driving people out to the actual, the actual streaming service. Now, I'm glad that he does mention this here, saying that if you are a paid member, that is when you got access to this movie. That makes a lot more sense to me. So again, I'm sorry for misspeaking earlier. I make mistakes too. I am human. But still, I think the fact still remains that you could definitely get because almost all streaming services have this, a trial, and then be able to watch this movie before actually canceling your numbers. And so, again, movie's doing very well. Let's go ahead and dive into the numbers now as well. Right, Five Nights at Freddy's, as I'd mentioned, for Universal, $19.4 million, so a massive 76% drop. So, again, in typical fashion, if most other movies, if this was, for instance, The Flash or other films like that, the reason why those drop-offs were so devastating for those films were because they were dropping off of very small openings, especially in comparison to what was expected initially and comparison to its budget. And so that's the reason why that was a huge downfall, right? Why that percentage was devastating for them. Whereas for a film like Five Nights at Freddy's, yeah, that's not good. It kind of shows you that this was definitely front-loaded, that this was definitely kind of front-loaded by fans that wanted to go see this movie in theaters that opening weekend to have that experience with other fans. And it's not really driving out a whole lot of other people to go and see it. So definitely not a great thing, but when your budget is only $20 million or so, it doesn't really matter. You still made $113.6 million domestically, which is a hell of a lot more than a lot of other films this year that had much bigger budgets and ended up having massive losses, even though they may have had better week 1 and week 2 drops. Taylor Swift is still hanging around. So this film is a film that continues to be in the top 2. Now 4 weeks on, a 13% hold in this market. So very, very good for AMC theaters. Obviously, the split between AMC and the Swift's family is going to be definitely beneficial to both. AMC is definitely probably liking this amount of money. $165.9 million is where that film currently is domestically. And based on the fact that there's just very few films coming out. I mean, yes, you technically have the Marvels coming out next weekend, but the early numbers for that film is that it could make maybe 50 million in its domestic opening, maybe more, right? Maybe between 50 and 70 million or so. So though that will definitely take the number 1 spot next weekend, films like Taylor Swift and, maybe not to the same extent of Five Nights at Freddy's will probably still be in that battle for second and third place. What will not be in that battle most likely is Killers of the Flower Moon. So even though this film added 154 theaters to its overall run, it made another $7 million, putting its overall domestic at 52.3 and only a 25% drop. So not one of the worst drops in the world. But remember, it had a drop in the 60s, I believe, if memory serves, last weekend. And so this is a movie costing $200 million that is going to be eventually an Apple TV Plus exclusive. And so this movie needed to make as much money as it possibly could in theaters, and it's just not doing it. We're not seeing a similar situation as we saw with Oppenheimer, right, which was kind of similar in that it was just about as long. But it was an incredibly long movie, and it also was a drama as well, made by a very talented filmmaker in the case of Oppenheimer, Christopher Nolan. The difference is that that movie was able to not only run on its own merits, but also was able to ride the coattails of Barbie, right? The whole Barbenheimer effect was huge for that movie, right? That movie ended up getting into the $900 million range worldwide and was able to do crazy amounts of money, not only in its opening few weeks, but was able to consistently hold on even after that, right? Was able to be in those top spots. The fact that this movie is already at $7 million is not putting it in a very good position. I might actually be able to give you a comparison between those two movies because I do think there are a lot of similarities. Now, I'm someone where I am actually excited to see this movie. I have read a lot of people that have saw it that thought it was boring, that said that put them to sleep, that said it just wasn't very good. I've also heard others who have been praising it as one of the best and are sad that films like Five Nights at Freddy's are doing better than it. But I've not seen it myself. I just, again, don't have 3.5 hours that I can leave my house as someone with kids. I got kids, man. I got kids. And they're at the age where I just can't really do that. So I'm actually just every day I'm checking and saying, okay, they finally released a date of when they're going to put this out on Apple TV Plus, because at this point, when you're making this little amount of money, I know that they wanted to get this in theaters for awards contention. Well, you've done that. I think now might be the time where you start to say, all right, let's actually make an announcement that we'll have this thing on Apple TV Plus in X amount of time, because then it's still in the general public consciousness, and maybe, just maybe, you'll be able to drive some subscribers over there. But if you have this thing with like a 45-day plus theatrical window, kind of like that standard theatrical window or the new standard theatrical window, I think you're going to have so little interest in this film by the time it does get on Apple TV Plus that you're not going to be able to kind of capitalize as much as you possibly could. That's just my own take. But again, take that for what it is. You also had an A24 film, Priscilla. This had gotten released last weekend in a very small amount of screens. And so as you can see, massive improvements here in the overall amount of money per theater there, right? You saw a last week a difference, instead of there being a drop, a 3,000% increase. But that happens when you open out in just a handful of theaters and then expand that out to over 1,000. So this is a limited A24 release. So we will be following this a little bit, but it's always one of those things you got to be cautious, because these films, again, A24 is always very weird with their release schedule. Every now and then they change it up. But I remember going back to Everything Everywhere All at Once, they did it where they released it in more and more theaters slowly over time. There's a lot of other releases, though, where they do this, where it's just in 4 or 5 theaters, and then they release it in over 1,000. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. This film has a budget to where it's not looking as good as it could, but definitely never rule out an A24 release. And then we lastly have the film Radical. I don't really know much about this movie. 419 screens, so that's a pretty good per theater ratio there. $2.7 million overall. And we do have some updated numbers here below in those top 10. But to try to save my voice as much as possible, we're just going to stick with our top 5 this week. So let's go ahead and go to Five Nights at Freddy's. So this film, $217 million worldwide. I don't think anyone thought this movie was going to be able to do that. This film's, again, on a $20 million budget, was able to take advantage of the Halloween crowd, right? That Halloween essence definitely played a role in last weekend being as high as it was. But the biggest thing, and this is something that I've heard from a lot of people, is that it served the fans, right? People who wanted to see a movie version of this story got exactly what they were expecting, got exactly what they wanted. People who had no idea what this was, or people who maybe had different expectations, maybe did not come out of it nearly as happy. I was someone where I had not played the games. I'd seen some people with their gameplay of this and overall kind of stayed away from it because I don't like horror films and horror games in general. Jump scares just are not really my thing. But I honestly did not know much of the lore behind it, or that there was even lore. So it made me even interested and more interested to find out more about it. So the fact that the film is doing as well, especially after it is doing so well with fans, makes me very happy. So again, very good numbers here, and I think that this film will continue to make more money. Obviously, it's made the vast majority of what's going to make, but there's still a chance this film getting to 250 by the end of its run. We'll have to wait and see, but I think 250 is definitely on the table, or at the very least, in that range. Taylor Swift's Eras Tour continuing to make money too. Again, I don't quite understand it. I know that she is very popular, and I know that there are a lot of students at my school who are massive Swifties, and I know that they have been driving a lot of the ticket sales for this movie, but $218 million. What's interesting there is that this movie, which had such a massive opening weekend and such a massive fan base, is actually not too far off from Five Nights at Freddy's. Five Nights at Freddy's actually might be able to technically do better, or at the very least end in a somewhat similar situation. Now, I do think that Taylor Swift might have a little bit more international appeal, but hey, the fact that this made $100 million versus Taylor Swift's $52 million, actually, you know what? That might end up showing that this movie is actually going to be able to do better because Peacock also, to my knowledge, is not an international streaming service, which means a lot of international audiences that might also be fans of the game, because the game would be something that could be international. Again, you're going to maybe see a little bit stronger hold there than versus the domestic market, where you do have the option to watch it on Peacock. Now let's talk about Killers of the Flower Moon. This movie, as I said, I have not seen it. I cannot speak to whether it is good or not. I've heard mixed things about it, and that's never a good thing for a movie that cost $200 million is a 3.5-hour movie. I don't quite understand, the reticence to them to put it on streaming at this point. I know that the mindset is, okay, we want to make as much money as possible. The movie's just not doing it, though. The movie's just not really capturing enough people or enough interest from people, especially in the era that we're in. And I know that Tony at Deadline and so many others in the media love to try to run with, well, if the actors weren't striking, this movie would be doing so much better. I really don't think that there is a strong or clear evidence, that there is any evidence you can really use that's going to make that compelling argument that would have somehow made a massive difference, right? You can't tell me, had Leo been able to fly around and talk to elite journalists and go to elite fan events, that somehow would have made, vastly more money than what it's already been making, right? Maybe you could say it could account for another, 5-10 million max. But I get at this point in time, at a $200 million budget, this film may not even get back to $200 million when it is done. But we all know it needs to make a heck of a lot more than that, as the film probably spent at least $100 million on the actual marketing, because that's just the typical marketing that most studios will spend. And then also add to that the fact it does not get 100% of its receipts back either. Not looking good for this movie. The movie Priscilla, $5.3 million, again from A24. Definitely a film that is has some potential. We'll have to wait and see. The budget is high enough to where it needs to do a little bit better than that, though. But as I said, with A24, you never want to, kind of rule them out. This is a film that I believe, let me see who is in this movie. I don't recognize any of the leading cast, but this is the new film from Sofia Coppola, who I know that there are some people out there that are fans or interested in Sofia Coppola. Then there is the film Radical, which is Eugenio Derbez, based on a true story. It's a Sundance film. Who will the sixth grade students at Jose Urbina Lopez Elementary in Matamoros become? They are among the worst performing students in Mexico. The world they know is one of violence and hardship, and their classrooms are dominated by an atmosphere of overbearing discipline, not possibility. So it looks like it's one of those motivational stories, and so I can imagine this film maybe being able to get some attention. I don't know much about it, so I can't say whether it's good or not, but obviously it's a film that, because of the nature of the story, might be able to catch some attention. And then there's also After Death. This is also a film I talked about last time. This is a new release from Angel Studios. It is a documentary. The fact that it's made $9 million as a documentary is already very impressive. However, no budget has been reported that I can find, which means that I can't really do much of a breakdown for that. Speaking of numbers, right, as I mentioned with Priscilla specifically, right, since that is the newer release this weekend from A24, the film cost $20 million to make, which means if you take into account typical marketing cost and just, again, typical takes between studios and theaters, the film right now is about $26 million in the red. It needs to make about $50 million or so to break even. So it's, again, is it possible? Sure, it's A24, never rule them out, but that is quite a hill to climb at only opening to $5.3 million. And because it got a massive boost this weekend for being out in more theaters, we're probably going to see a drop off next weekend if I had to guess, but we have to, again, wait and see what those, technically next weekend will be its second weekend numbers. We'll have to wait and see what those numbers look like at that point. After Death, can't really say much about it because the film does not have a budget that's reported, but for a, again, for a documentary, that is still very good. Right now, I'm projecting based on the trend of what it's doing right now and based off of typical historical trends, the film likely will make somewhere between 12 and 18 million when everything is said and done. I don't think we're going to get the same level of the Sound of Freedom effect since it is a documentary dealing with the near-death experiences, and that is just something that's not going to appeal to everybody. We can make some projections on Five Nights at Freddy's, now in its second weekend of release, even though it was a massive drop-off from its previous weekend at 217 million worldwide. Right now, based off of typical trends, historical data, the movie will probably make somewhere between $310 and $434 million. Because it had such a massive drop-off domestically, I don't think there's a chance it's going to get anywhere close to that $400 million number. I would say $250, $300 million is probably going to be where this film ends up. It doesn't really matter at this point because the film already, as of the recording of this video, at 217 worldwide, has made roughly $100 million in net gain profits. So massive return on investment, only cost $20 million. This is the kind of thing that a movie like Priscilla, for instance, would be wanting to see massive profits. But again, A24, Priscilla, probably not looking for that. But Five Nights at Freddy's, we could absolutely say, is a massive win and is more profitable than some of the biggest films to come out this year. Kind of going back a little bit further, right? Let's talk about some of the other movies that this movie, Five Nights at Freddy's, is actually beating. So this film, Five Nights at Freddy's, at 217 million worldwide, is beating what Saw 10 made at $94 million. Let's see, beat what The Creator made, which is not that surprising because Creator was not that much of a success. Haunting in Venice, which made $110 million. The Nun 2, which was a very successful horror film this year, $265 million. So Five Nights at Freddy's definitely is within striking distance of that movie. Blue Beetle from Warner Brothers, right? Only made $128 million. So this film's already decimating Blue Beetle. This film, let me try to see if there's any others I can kind of compare this to. TMNT Mutant Mayhem, it did better than that movie. $242 million for Sound of Freedom, so it's actually, again, also up there with that. Insidious 5, it is also beating that number. What's actually even more impressive is the fact that The Flash, right, one of the most expensive films to come out this year, if not ever, $266.5 million is what that film ultimately made by the end of its run. There is a chance, at the very least, that Five Nights at Freddy's does better. Not only, obviously, with profits, it's already vastly more profitable than all of the movies that have come out from the MCU and DC this year. However, the fact that its raw box office might actually match and do better theoretically than a movie like The Flash just is incredible and is amazing. So anyway, I did want to give an update on that. And lastly, updating Killers of the Flower Moon with only making $109 million worldwide. Right now, again, I am projecting this film to be a massive $200 plus million dollar loss by the end of it, right? This film is definitely doing better than expected, right? So based off of where it was after the first 2 weeks of release at $53 million, I had projected this film to be somewhere between 75 and 106. So actually, technically, if you look at these numbers here, you look at that worldwide number, this movie's actually doing, let me make sure that's correct. Yeah. So this film is actually already more than doubled what its overall box office was. So this film's already a chart breaker in this way. The problem, though, is that it's just not enough to make up for the amount of money that it needs to make back. And so those are the numbers. You can check out my chart over at OMBReviews.com if you want to look further into any other films that you might have interest in or look for the newest updates on those. All these numbers should be updated on the second chart at the very least. I have it set to auto update. I'll try and get my first chart updated as well. But anyway, what are y'all's thoughts about this? Do you think that After Death is going to be able to, continue to add on to its money? I think the big story is going to be kind of Five Nights at Freddy's versus Killers of the Flower Moon, right? Five Nights at Freddy's is doing very, very well. Have you seen it? What did you think about it? Did you think it was any good? What do you think the final total is going to be? Right now, based on the numbers, $250, $300 million is where I'm thinking the film's going to end because it is seeing quite steep drop-offs. But ultimately, it's doing a heck of a lot better than what Killers of the Flower Moon is doing. And though there is still that outside chance that Killers of the Flower Moon, slowly, incrementally over time just adds a little bit more, week after week after week, I don't think it's going to have nearly enough momentum to carry it over all the edge, carry it over to the edge, carry it over to the point where it needs to be. And I guess the last thing that I will do, because I did mention this earlier, so if you've stuck around this long, hey, guess what? You get a little bit of a bonus here. I was going to try and see if this site would actually load, if I could put this up against Oppenheimer, because I think some people might be wondering, hey, how is this film doing in comparison to that? Well, here's the big difference, right? Oppenheimer had a much bigger opening weekend, right? By the end of its opening weekend, it was 82 million versus 23 million. And again, we're talking about a film that had a roughly similar runtime and also a very similar story as far as it being a drama at the very least, and then look at just how well this movie did down the stretch also. So I don't think that we are seeing the kinds of numbers, right, 52 million is where this film is domestically, whereas Oppenheimer was at 228. Because we're not seeing the Barbenheimer effect, I just cannot see the film getting to the 945 or anywhere close to that of Oppenheimer. I think this film would be lucky to get to 200, maybe 250. And I would say at a stretch, $300 million, still far below the 500 plus million it needs to break even. But let me know your thoughts about that as well in the comment section down below. If you like this video, smash that like button. A lot of fun about asking, smash the rumble button as well. You guys are all amazing and beautiful people. Hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. And as always, God bless. And now for a special shout out to all of my Chosen of Valhalla members for the month of November, starting off with Father Luca Illich, Rosetta Allen, check out her YouTube channel, the name Eagle Rider. Miss Martin Muses, check out her YouTube channel by the same name. Matt317, check out his Twitch channel. Laura, the Mother Major General Story. Sorry, I didn't have enough spirit fingers there. Mr. Roy and ZK Man, who can check out over at xtheboundaries.co. If you want your name shouted out at the end of every live stream and video, check out the top link in the video description below. You get access to things like the giveaways channel, a podcast that I try to do every single month with a bunch of other awesome YouTubers, and a plethora of other content. So go ahead and check that out if you want more. You guys are all amazing and beautiful people. Hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. And as always, God bless.